The victory with which the Roman general Aetius with his Gothic allies had been gained over the Huns was the last victory of Imperial Rome. But among the long fasti of her triumphs, few can be found that, for their importance and ultimate benefit to mankind, are comparable with this expiring effort of her arms. It did not, indeed, open to her any new career of conquest. It did not consolidate the relics of her power. It did not turn the rapid ebb of her fortunes. The mission of Imperial Rome was, in truth, already accomplished. She had received and transmitted, through her once ample dominion, the civilization of Greece. She had broken up the barriers of narrow nationalities among the various states and tribes that dwelt around the coast of the Mediterranean. She had fused these and many other races into one organized empire, bound together by a community of laws, of government, and institutions. Under the shelter of her full power, the true faith had arisen in the earth, and during the years of her decline it had been nourished to maturity and had overspread all the provinces that ever obeyed her sway. For no beneficial purpose to mankind could the dominion of the seventh-hilled city have been restored or prolonged, but it was all important to mankind what nations should divide among them Rome's rich inheritance of empire. Whether the Germanic and Gothic warriors should form states and kingdoms out of the fragments of her dominions and become the free members of the Commonwealth of Christian Europe, or whether pagan savages from the wilds of Central Asia should crush the relics of classic civilization and the early institutions of the Christianized Germans in one hopeless chaos of barbaric conquest. The Christian Visigoths of King Theodoric fought and triumphed at Chalons, side by side with the legions of Aetius. Their joint victory over the Hunnish host not only rescued for a time from destruction the old age of Rome, but preserved for centuries a power and glory, the Germanic element in the civilization of modern Europe. Don't know what was with that voice. Okay, these are the words of Sir Edward Shepherd Creasy with an excellent accent, and they come from his 1851 work, The 15 Decisive Battles of the World. In this series, we've been looking at various battles on Creasy's list, starting with the Battle of Marathon and moving forwards through time to trace the evolution of history through military combat. You can click in the link here for the full playlist, which looks at the battles of Marathon, Syracuse, Gaugamela, Metaurus, and Teutoburg. The first three battles look at the Greek powers of antiquity, and this video caps off the look at Roman contribution to world history. Today, we're looking at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in 451 AD, also known as the Battle of Chalons, if you're French, I don't know how to say it, where Rome and its Germanic allies clashed with Attila the Hun in a contest that might have decided the trajectory of Dark Ages Europe. In this video, we're going to be looking at the wider historical context that led up to the battle, the factions and people involved, the armament, strength, and strategy of the combatants, and of course the battle itself, and an exploration of its impact on world history. We'll get into all that, but first remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content. To understand the world in which the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains took place, we really have to look at three main factions. The first of these, as you might expect, is Rome. Through the series, we've seen Rome change a lot. In the 3rd century BC, Rome was a burgeoning republic on the Italian peninsula looking to win its place on the Mediterranean from its competitors. In the 1st century AD, Rome was a powerful empire at its peak, conquering much of Europe, only really being checked at the Rhine. But now, in the 5th century, Rome was a shadow of its former self. After Rome's golden age in the 1st and 2nd centuries, instability began to creep in, with various leaders occasionally splitting the empire into pieces. This most notably happened with the imperial crisis in the 200s, when a mix of revolts, invasions, migrations, economic collapse, plague, climate change, and dozens of claimants to the title of emperor split the empire into 3 pieces, although it was eventually reassembled under Diocletian in 284. However, Diocletian realized that by this point the realm was too big and unstable to be ruled by one man, and he decided to split the empire into pieces, first into 2 and then 4 realms. The east and west were ruled by their respective Augusti, who ruled from Milan and Nicomedia, and their junior leaders, or Caesari, were based in Trier and Sirmium. I'm sure I said that right. This system didn't work out that well, actually, as eventually one of the Caesari in the west, Constantine, would reconquer and unify the whole Roman Empire in 324. Constantine legalized Christianity prior to this, and later it became mandatory, transforming most of Europe into a Christian continent very quickly. The newfound strong leadership and religion couldn't keep the empire together, however, and after his death, Rome was split into 3 pieces to each of his sons. Eventually, the empire split down the middle in 395 between east and west, with the former based in Constantinople, founded by Constantine, and the west eventually back in capital of Western Roman Empire. It's not Rome, it's actually... that's not right either. Ravenna? That being said, the west capital would actually move to other cities as well, including Ravenna. The east would actually go on to live a long and generally powerful life, only ending in 1453. The west, meanwhile, began to fall in large part because of the next faction, the Germans. The German tribes of Europe had generally lived in the area of modern-day Germany and Poland, Central Eastern Europe, mostly outside the Roman realm. Attempts had been made to conquer them centuries earlier, but these efforts failed and the Germans lived beside the Romans. We looked at this in the last battle in this series, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, which you can watch here. A force from the east, however, forced many of them to move west into Roman territory, which by now was starting to weaken. These Germanic tribes began to raid and conquer Roman territories for themselves, with the Romans leaving Britain to the Saxons in 410, and much of Iberia being lost to the Suebi at the same time. The Vandals conquered Western Africa and Sicily about 2 decades later. In mainland Europe, Germanic tribes weren't as successful at carving out vast kingdoms, but they still frequently warred with Rome and created massive instability in the region. By the mid-5th century, Rome had reconquered most of the territories in Gaul lost to the Germans, and the factions maintained an uneasy peace for the most part. It is these factions of Germans that we are going to focus on the most. In the northwest of Gaul, in modern Brittany, the Armoricans had taken land for themselves. Further east, Franks had carved out their part of the empire in the area of Germania Inferior. Allied with Rome were some kingdoms, designated feudorati, which were effectively vassal states of Rome that had varying degrees of warmness to the empire. They would exchange safety and peace and resources in exchange for supplying men to the Roman army. Chief among them were the Visigoths, who lived in western Gaul. The Visigoths were easily the most powerful of the Roman client states. However, they were often at odds with Rome, and peace was only a product of temporary convenience. Just north of Italy, the Alans and Burgundians were in a similar situation, although both groups were much friendlier with Rome, especially the Alans. However, none of these Germanic tribes would have had to deal with Rome in the first place if it weren't for the third faction, the Huns. Originally native to the plains of China and Mongolia, the emergence of other nomadic groups pushed them out. Moving west, the Huns became a formidable nomadic force over the 4th century, tearing through Central Asia and eventually Europe. By the late 300s AD, Huns had invaded European lands from what would become Russia to Germany to Ukraine to Serbia, and maybe even the Baltics, mostly checked by the borders of the Roman realms and the ocean. This of course forced mass migration from these lands into Rome, playing a large part in destabilizing the region and producing the tense politics of the era. The Germans couldn't deal with the Hunnic raiding, and Romans weren't strong enough to stop the Germans from migrating into their provinces and effectively making them their own. If the Huns were the hammer in this analogy, the Germans were the nail, and Rome was the board. Hunnic expansion had reached the Danube River and even parts of Pannonia, or modern-day Hungary, by the 430s. Previous attempts had been made on Roman areas, namely Pannonia and the Balkan areas, and Roman forces had struggled to defeat them. Paying off the Huns was the primary strategy of both East and West Rome, as exemplified by a peace treaty with the East in 382. The Huns, however, were not a fully unified people. Throughout this era, various Hunnic leaders struggled for power, and the Huns were really more of a loose confederacy, preventing large-scale mobilization while also allowing the Romans to buy off parts of their people, helping to keep them weak in the face of a more organized enemy. The heavy reliance on horses also made it so that the Huns could really only inhabit large plain areas to actually keep up the feeding of their horses. In the early 5th century, this began to change and consolidation of the Huns began. Records seem to first mention a leader named Ruga, who in 422 successfully raided the east all the way to Constantinople and forced them to pay a yearly tribute. Still, it is not understood if Ruga was the supreme leader of the Huns or merely a leader in the western regions. It's also worth noting at this point that the Huns weren't always at odds with Rome. At the end of the day, it seems both parties were mostly interested in wealth and land. Rome wanted to preserve its territory, and the Huns wanted wealth and by some accounts were also an inherently warlike people and just enjoyed war itself. Sometimes these interests overlapped. We know, for example, that a Roman general had Huns in his army for a campaign in the 420s, and that the same decade saw Hunnic forces under Rome in North Africa. Despite their modern reputation, the Huns also participated in diplomacy and peaceful resolution. Statecraft and unifying the various nomadic groups of Eastern Europe and Central Asia was as key to the Hunnic states as their prowess in combat. In 434 or 35, we don't know, Ruga died and his nephews Attila and Bleda came to power, possibly splitting the Hunnic realms between themselves in East and West. Still, the complex political alliances continued, with the Huns generally cooperating with West Rome and raiding the East and selectively working with or decimating the Germanic tribes. Geography was on the West's side, of course, and it was a bit harder to invade the West than it was to invade the East. Attila, however, had eyes for Rome, and while he maintained friendly relations, this was by no means out of conviction, rather convenience. As soon as an opportunity arose, Attila was sure to pounce on the last power he had yet to vanquish. For the next decade, the Hun brothers would maintain the balance of power in the East, while the West's last great man would emerge to check the Huns. This man was Flavius Aetius. From an early age, Aetius became acquainted with Rome's neighbors, as he was often a hostage. This type of hostage isn't someone who was just captured and kept prisoner, but rather a political hostage. Just as Arminius was sent to Rome centuries earlier, Aetius was sent to Rome's neighbors as a sign of goodwill, not only developing an understanding of other cultures, but also ensuring that local Roman nobles wouldn't fight too much with the other faction. At age 18, Aetius lived with the Visigoths for 3 years before transferring to live with the Huns in 408. There he stayed until 425. Where he returned to Italy to depose a new emperor who was installed by the East. He actually led the Huns into battle against the Eastern Roman Empire in order to try to save the Western Roman Empire. While he was unsuccessful, he compromised with the emperor and rose to the title of Magister Militum of Gaul and became the general of armies in that area, balancing Rome's power against the Germanic barbarians, perhaps more so than any other general. Not only was he the dominant general, he was probably the dominant single figure in Rome, as the emperor at this time was still a child, and Aetius effectively controlled the foreign policy most pressing to the Roman Empire. On this front, things began to heat up in 444 or 45, when Attila killed his brother and took sole control of the Hunnic lands. Hunnic, I keep changing it up. The Romans, playing both sides, fomented rebellion against Attila. At the same time, East Rome stopped paying its tribute to the Huns, which had generally stopped the constant raiding. By 447, the Huns had consolidated and retaliated, this time raiding all the way into Thermopylae in coastal Greece before once again agreeing to peace in 450. With all this conflict, Attila founded his new capital at Buda on the banks of the Danube, making it easier for him to command and mobilize against the Europeans. It seemed at this point that the Huns were unstoppable militarily. Now unified under a strong leader, the Huns were the real power in Europe. Things got even more tense in 450, and like Teutoburg before it, it all started with love. Sort of, not really, probably. In Rome, the emperor's sister, Justa Grata Honoria, was betrothed to a Roman elite who she didn't really like, and for whatever reason, she sent a message to Attila with her ring explaining her situation. She may have simply been trying to get him to pressure the Romans to let her choose her own suitor, but Attila actually took this as an invitation to marriage. The leader of the Huns promptly demanded Honoria's hand in message and half of the empire as his dowry. And of course, the Romans refused and tried to clear up the misconception. Attila, of course, had already made up his mind with his newfound justification and led the Huns on a campaign into Western Europe. Attila had his sights fixed on Rome, but he still needed to cross the Rhine, which was still fortified by the Romans. No matter what, Attila would have to fight to even get into Roman territory. But in 451, a Frankish leader whose name is lost to history died, causing a rift between his two sons. In a bid for the sons to gain power, they each allied with the neighboring powers. The younger of the brothers called for help from Rome, and eventually he would actually be adopted by Aetius. The elder, however, called on help from the Huns. This gave Attila an opening, and in the spring of that year, Attila moved across the Rhine peacefully into Frankish territory, probably around the modern city of Mainz. From there, the raiding began. Mainz, Worms, and Strasbourg were the first, before the Huns split into two groups, the smaller one moving north, while the larger one, headed by Attila, moved south along the Moselle. Cologne fell, then Trier, Metz, Reims, Amiens, some cities either through pleading or just strong walls, survived, like Paris and Troyes. In the fall of 451, Attila came to the walls of Orleans, a city that would see another key battle a millennia later. Orleans, however, gave a stiff resistance and stalled the Huns on the banks of the Loire. Meanwhile, Aetius and the Romans began to panic. More than the Hunnic invasion, the Romans had lived under the specter of a prophecy that foretold their demise. In the founding myths of Rome, Romulus had murdered Remus, and for his successful fratricide, 12 vultures appeared to him, each symbolizing a century that Rome would survive. That was in 745 BC, and the anniversary of that 1200-year mark came in 445. The year Attila rose to power and founded Buda in Europe. It seemed foretold to the Romans that they would fall to the Hun, and a deep anxiety gripped the elites of the empire. Aetius raised a Roman army, but at this time the empire was in dire economic straits, barely holding on, and couldn't field an army large enough to combat the Huns. Fortunately, Aetius had inroads with the Germanic interlopers of the empire, many of whom despised the Huns for pushing them out of their homelands. Keep in mind that while Rome was at this time against the Huns, they weren't in principle opposed to cooperating with them or even the Germans. The Germans, meanwhile, were the principal victims of Hunnic expansion and thus were deeply motivated to fight them off. Aetius knew this and reached out to the foremost barbarian leader, Theodoric of the Visigoths, for help. Theodoric agreed, and along with his son Thurismund, led a large Visigoth force to Rome's aid. Aetius gathered more forces to his side, including the Burgundians, friendly Franks, and the Alans. In the fall of 451, this combined army moved to the opposite bank of the Loire from Attila, bolstering the besieged Alan city. Orleans had held up quite well against the Huns, although this may have in part been to a promise made by the Huns. Allegedly, Sangipan, the leader of the Alans, had been in the city and had agreed to open the gates for Attila in exchange for keeping his power in the area. As a result, the Huns probably were initially lax with their siege. One way or another, however, Sangipan was either stopped or he just changed his mind, and the Huns were never given access. Either way, Orleans resisted against the Huns better than any city before it, and the added show of force of the arriving coalition army forced Attila to back off. The siege was broken, and the horde retreated further east towards the Marne. Attila didn't get there, and set up camp around the Catalaunian plains, probably near the city of Troyes. The Roman coalition pursued them, and the two forces situated themselves on either side of the battlefield, ready to fight for the future of Rome. Despite me saying the Huns over and over again, Attila's army actually was made up of many groups, mostly Germanic tribes from southeastern Europe. The Huns themselves relied heavily on mobile light cavalry and archery, and most of their tactics and armament revolved around these two things. The Huns actually tried to avoid pitched battles as well as sieges, since a well-disciplined, well-armored group in formation was historically the best counter to cavalry. When possible, Huns would try to ambush or surprise their enemies, or even intimidate them into capitulation. Perhaps their most effective method of intimidation was keeping many more horses with their army than they had riders. These horses were generally spares that would be used when horses died in battle. It also had the added effect of tricking enemies into thinking that the Hunnic force was much larger than it actually was. This could contribute to some accounts of the Huns at this time, who stated that Attila invaded Gaul with 200,000 men. The army in reality was likely much smaller than this. When it did come to the battlefield, the Huns would generally form up in a line of wedge formations against the enemy, although some sources claim that they used more uniform formations. Another force was generally kept in reserve, either to cover a retreat, add to the center of gravity, or surprise the enemy with a flank. When charging, Huns would let out an intimidating war cry as their line would splinter apart, and different clans would fight the enemy independently, swarming the opponent and allowing for easier flanking and encirclement. Rather than close in, the Huns preferred to use bows and attack the enemy from afar, reducing casualties and being optimally effective against formations equipped to fight cavalry. If the enemy formation held, the Huns would often feign retreat and turn tail away from the enemy. Oftentimes, the opponent would give chase, and believing the battle to be won, would break formation as they pursued. It was at this point that the Huns would counterattack, drawing them into less favorable terrain if possible, and swarm the scattered forces. To facilitate this warfare, Huns were lightly armored and equipped. The average Hun likely had some textile-based armor, but more powerful individuals had mail. For headgear, wealthier Huns would wear iron helmets, usually of the Spagenhelm or Bandhelm types. Less fortunate Huns likely wore textile caps. Huns also adorned their horses in armor sometimes, often again textile-based or iron plating or mail. The primary Hunnic weapon was the Hunnic bow. The Hunnic bow was an interesting design and was a reinforced asymmetric composite recurve bow. There's a bunch of physics in this, but pretty much the sharp recurve in the bow makes it able to impart more energy into the arrow. The composite aspect means that on top of wood, another material, usually antler, was added to the arms of the bow to make it more elastic. These two factors allowed the bow to be smaller while still having the same power as a larger longbow. Hunnic bows were also reinforced with bones, usually in the grip and ears, which some think further increased their power. Additionally, some Hunnic bows were asymmetric, meaning that the place where you held the bow and fired the arrow from wasn't in the center, but a bit further down on the bow. Since the Hunnic, also sometimes called Hunnish bows, were about 5 feet long, this made them a lot easier to use from horseback while still retaining their power, decreasing the draw length but increasing the draw weight to compensate. Hunnic arrows are also thought to have been unique in that they had trilobate heads, being triangular in cross-section rather than flat. This made the arrows heavier and likely reduced their range, but made them better at penetrating armor. And of course, the Huns were aware of this and used lighter arrows for longer range engagements, as did virtually every cavalry-based group at this time. When Huns did close with the enemies, they usually used some sort of lance with an iron head around 10 feet long total. For swords, Huns usually had one of two weapons. Perhaps the more common blade was the Langsix, a progenitor to the Sikhs that would become common in Viking cultures. About 24 inches in the blade, the Langsix had a narrower profile than later versions, but kept the single edge and sharp point. Another, longer sword was used as well, similar to the Roman spatha with a 33-inch double-edged blade. These swords were actually more similar to Persian weapons of the time and had a diamond-shaped guard for the hand, often decorated with gold, signifying these were weapons of the elites. Attila allegedly also wielded the infamous Sword of Mars, which was said to have had magic properties that made him so successful, although no one really knows A, if this was a real thing, and B, what type of sword it may have been. It is also thought that Huns may have used lassos, as one Roman source says, quote, "They throw strips of..." I sound like Obama. "They throw strips of cloth plaited into nooses over their opponents and so entangle them that they fetter their limbs and take from them the power of riding or walking." This would presumably be used at medium range where an opponent couldn't strike them with their weapon, granting the Huns a slight range advantage in close quarters, especially against more skilled fighters. Due to their nomadic nature, the Huns didn't invest much in fortification, and when they traveled, base camps were usually protected by circled wagons and masses of archers. By the same token, they were also not very great at siege warfare compared to their opponents. Aside from the Huns, large groups of Germanic clans marched to invade Rome and their Germanic allies. While we don't have a comprehensive list, it is believed that the Gepids, Rugians, Burgundians, Sciri, Thuringians, Ostrogoths, and Franks worked with the Huns throughout this era and in this battle. These groups are largely East Germanic and originally lived in areas of the modern Balkans, Ukraine, Poland, and Russia, farther east than the Germanics that we covered in the Teutoburg video. The Franks, however, lived more in central and northern parts of modern Germany. It is worth noting, just as a side note, that Goths or Gothic groups were a form of Germans, but they tended to live further east. While similar to their earlier, more western cousins at Teutoburg, Eastern Germanics, namely Goths and Vandals, had significant differences in armament and tactics, partly due to contact with Eastern nomads, and partly due to more available technology. The basics stayed the same. A wooden shield, usually of medium size, oblong or hexagonal, and sporting an iron boss, sometimes pointed, was the staple of the loadout. With time and organization, coupled with an increased need for militarization, more and more troops had metal armor. Chainmail was common, but iron scale and lamellar armor became popular in East Germanic circles as well. It is worth noting, of course, that the better gear would generally be reserved for the elites, as they were the only ones who could afford it. These elites may also have used vambraces and greaves, especially when on horseback. Iron helmets, often Roman ridge style, protected the head with cheek, nose, and neck protection, and of course, a reinforced ridge along the top. The type of weapons changed somewhat as well. While a spear was the primary weapon, the furmia that we looked at last time weren't as popular, in large part because the Germans were fighting cavalry. This required a longer pike-like spear which wasn't thrown, likely between 10 to 12 feet long with an iron head. Swords and sixes were more popular by this time as well, Sixes, as we've seen, were generally single-edged, shorter blades. However, longer swords existed as well. Some were styled like Roman spathas, with a double-edged blade around 33 to 36 inches in length, and some actually were Persian in style, which we looked at already, with a diamond-shaped crossguard. Single-edged long swords probably were used as well. To the west, with the Franks, swords closely resembling later Viking swords began to develop, with large triangular pommels and small guards. To replace the medium-range capability of the Furmia, troops usually carried a Francisca axe. Usually around 16 to 18 inches long, the Francisca was a throwing axe with a recognizable, swept underside and narrow head. At range, bows were used, likely both longbows and compound styles. Cavalrymen, usually wealthier and as a result better armored, used a lance, likely 10 to 12 feet long. Riders still didn't have stirrups, and spurs and four-pronged saddles that hugged the rider's thighs were used instead. The styles of these groups differed to some degree. Some were mostly cavalry-based like the Ostrogoths, and some were infantry-based, although all seemed to have relied on heavy infantry and cavalry more so than lighter troops of the past. When fighting, these groups likely formed into wedges like we talked about last time. Instead of using the Furmia, soldiers would throw their Francisca axes when approaching in an attempt to disrupt and damage the shield lines of their opponents more than to kill, then closing for closer combat with the enemy. With cavalry, heavy and light troops would work in tandem, with the lighter, more maneuverable and independent archers taking pot shots and softening up the enemy, opening up weaknesses for the heavy riders to charge into, decimating the formation. These technologies and tactics largely remained the same for the Germanic groups allied with the Romans. As far as we know, the Germanic groups that joined Rome were the Visigoths, Alans, Franks, Amoricans, Burgundians, Saxons, and Olibrones. The eastern influences of the increased cavalry, lances, and scale armor occurred a little less here, but otherwise weapons and tactics remained the same. We also know that some of these groups, like the Alans and maybe Burgundians, were skilled cavalrymen. In addition to these West Germanic groups, a powerful force from the east joined the alliance, the Sarmatians. Originally living in the modern area of Ukraine, the Sarmatians were skilled horseback riders who had lived in the steppe before they were pushed out by the Goths and later the Huns. Sarmatians were overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, cavalry fighters, especially heavy cavalry. Sarmatians often utilized extremely heavy armored troops, known as cataphracts, a class of warrior that had also been utilized by the Romans and Sassanid Persians. Scale or lamellar armor was the primary form of protection, with the horse having multiple swaths of protective sheets across its body. Riders utilized similar forms of protection, sometimes using chainmail as well as more protective scale and lamellar armors. Helmets of various sorts, often with a chainmail veil underneath, were used as well, essentially making cataphracts the closest thing to a medieval knight in antiquity. For weaponry, Sarmatians used the kontos, a lance about 14 feet long and wielded with two hands. The lance was secured with a sling or straps to either the rider or the horse, and the force generated by this weapon is said to have been enough to run through two men. Sarmatians also used compound bows, spatha-like swords, and sometimes maces topped with a head of various shapes. Some cataphracts also carried small circular shields. An assortment of maces and axes were probably used by most of these cavalry forces to some degree, in addition to spears and swords. The Romans themselves had similar cavalry at this time, although curved or circular metal plates covered the limbs. This elite group, known as the Clibinari, made up about 15% of their cavalry corps. Another quarter were unarmored or lightly equipped horse archers, similar to the Huns, and the remaining 60% were armed and armored in a similar way to the infantry, plus a lance. Overall, cavalry played a smaller role in the Roman army compared to their nomadic and Germanic groups, but it certainly was a larger factor than in the past. For context, about 20% of Rome's land forces were cavalry at this time, compared to about 2% at the height of the empire. The Roman infantry, however, had changed from the peak of the empire. Through the last 3 videos, we've seen the evolution of Roman fighting. In the late stages of the empire, the weapons and tactics once again changed, in many ways echoing earlier incarnations, as well as adapting to a more conservative slant. Lorica segmentata, popular in the early empire, had largely been replaced by Lorica hamata, or male, which was in some ways a reversion to the Republic period. These male cuirasses also tended to cover the arms more than earlier versions, however. Helmets were updated as well, and mostly revolved around the Roman ridge pattern, which provided more protection than the earlier models. Greaves were also less common, if not entirely done away with. The Roman shield at this time, now called a scuda or clipei, had done away with the scutum-style convex shape and changed to a bold, oblong style of similar size. For weapons, the primary offensive force turned from the gladius to the hasta, a spear around 6 to 8 feet long. In conjunction with the shield, soldiers would form a shield wall and utilized the oblong curves on the top to let their spears protrude forward. Once again, we can see a movement towards minimizing casualties by better protecting the soldiers and keeping enemies at a range. This gets even more obvious when we continue down the armament list. The gladius had been done away with entirely and was replaced by the spatha, its 30-inch bladed cousin. A shorter sword, known as the semi-spatha, may have existed as well, however, and was shorter with a 20-inch blade closer to what was historically a gladius. Sikhs-style knives were utilized as well, and replaced the shorter pugio. For missile weapons, high-ranking infantry would carry a javelin, known as a spilculum, similar to a pilum but with a less pronounced wooden head. The more common missile weapon was the plumbate, a medium-sized dart that shared the basic head shape and weighted concept of the pilum, but of course was smaller and may have had fins. Soldiers would carry 6 of these, and because of their size they could be thrown much farther, close to 100 feet. Light armored missile-based troops made a comeback as well, with horse archers, often Germanic, being used alongside slingers. Roman archers, armed with compound bows, would also fight on foot, but carried smaller circular shields instead of the scutum-type protection, and likely utilized the semi-spatha and Sikhs more than main infantry. In battle, the main Roman heavy infantry would form up close together like the legions before them, one of the few things that actually carried over from the Augustinian period. Cavalry would protect the flanks, a van of horse archers and slingers were positioned in front, and infantry archers were at the back of the main formation. A reserve unit of cavalry and infantry would stay back as well. During combat, the van and main archers would weaken the enemy at range before the van fell back. Rather than charge, the Romans preferred to let the enemy initiate, allowing them to maintain formation better. The aforementioned shield wall tactic was utilized, while the heavy cavalry, aided by horse archers, would try to defeat enemy cavalry before enveloping the infantry. That being said, the Roman army actually preferred a more Punic style of warfare, in that they would prefer to ambush or attack the enemies by surprise instead of having large pitched battles. We can see that on virtually every level the Romans had become less aggressive. Better armor, longer weapons, and less initiative tactics were all adopted in an effort to reduce casualties. Even the main strategy of the Romans shifted from pitched battles to opportunistic strikes on vulnerable or unprepared enemies. It is worth noting that despite all of this, the military was still actually quite strong and won most battles that it engaged in. The issue was really the Roman economy, which couldn't afford to maintain a large army and keep replacing dead soldiers. Like many more recent historical examples, the downfall of Rome militarily was not actually the fighters getting worse, but the economy and politicians being unwilling or unable to keep them maintained. We can also look quickly at the idea that the military failed because too many barbarians joined up, called the barbarization theory, which theoretically caused a breakdown of discipline and fracturing of forces when fighting other barbarians, who would often desert and just join their brethren against Rome. While it's certainly true the barbarians made up a much larger portion of the army than they had previously, probably 30 to 40%, it was still mostly Roman. While there were documented instances of barbarians defecting, it generally only happened on a very localized level if barbarian Roman fighters were fighting the specific clan that they belonged to within a wider tribe, not simply joining any barbarians they came across. And, as we've already discussed, the military machine still worked well, it just didn't have enough money or manpower towards the end to protect the empire. Across the board, we see that European warriors are mostly moving in the same direction of heavily armored cavalry and infantry. It's no surprise then that Middle Ages Europe would continue to develop this pattern. Roman units, unlike previous centuries, are also difficult to ascertain. Much of the Roman military organization by this point had become jumbled, and standardization, coupled with a chronic lack of manpower, meant that unit sizes and compositions were often built up of what could be mustered or organized rather than some preset pattern. That being said, this was more so at the large legion levels. While at this level things tended to change and shrink, the lower levels of organization with the cohorts, centuries, and contubernium units of 480, 80, and 8 fighting men largely stayed the same. As we said, cavalry units were larger, although how exactly they were divided into units isn't as well known. Siege weapons, such as ballista, were also a larger part of the legions, but this wouldn't have factored in much at the Catalaunian plains. Force sizes for the battle are hard to come by, although it's thought that both forces were of similar size. Even for the Romans, it is difficult to find records of this time, as records of troop numbers largely stopped by the early 5th century. It is thought that before the West's loss of North Africa, the Roman army would have been around 45,000 men, much smaller than the earlier 250,000 mark of Augustus. However, the army likely would have shrunk considerably after the loss of Africa, as it could no longer finance an army of that size. Also, given that Rome likely wouldn't have sent its whole army, we are left with a small, albeit very rough, number of about 10,000 men, which would probably break down into 8,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. It is thought that the Visigoths under Theodoric were able to raise a much larger faction of about 25,000, and we can estimate that it would have more cavalry than Rome, say 30%, for about 7,500 cavalry and 17,500 infantry. It is also worth noting at this point that the barbarians likely had larger numbers than the Romans, not just because they had larger populations, which they didn't, but because a larger proportion of their men went to the military, which is still a mystery debated to this day as to why the Romans had such a low level of military men actually going into the military instead of other things. The rest of the barbarian groups probably added up to another 15,000 men, probably with a slightly higher percentage of cavalry given the Alans and Sarmatians, maybe around 40%. In total, the Roman alliance likely had around 50,000 men, perhaps close to 35,000 infantry and 16,000 cavalry, give or take. The Huns, meanwhile, likely had a similar number of around 50,000. It's harder for us to estimate how this was broken down, but given the Huns' near exclusive use of cavalry and a rate of perhaps 30 to 40% for some Germanic tribes, we could guess that they were able to field around 35,000 cavalry and 15,000 infantry. However, all of these numbers are getting heavily into guesswork. Like the numbers of the battle, the location is also up for debate. We know that the battle took place in what is northeastern France, likely northeast of Orleans. Sources of the time mention a hill or ridge, and interpretations of this range from a battlefield consisting of a plain with a hill to one side, or the whole battle fighting on a ridge for control of the high ground. Most scholars believe the latter. The specific location is not known, but perhaps the most well-supported site is the ridge of the modern village of Montiaux, not far west of Troyes. This is largely based on A, the geography, and B, other sources that claim to know the locations of the base camps before the battle, and C, local names for geographic features such as, these are translated obviously, Hell and the River of Corpses. As such, this video will be assuming that Montgueux is the battlefield. Zooming in, we see an open plain leading to foothills with a pass moving west through them. The foothill's distinct feature is a rather steep, U-shaped hill pointing northeast, with the inside of the U being a bit less steep. The main ridgeline, facing roughly southeast, stretched roughly 2 miles and has a prominence of around 300 to 350 feet, with around 300 yards of run separating the crest from the foot. 1.5 miles southeast, a stream starts that flows towards Troyes.
Akira the Don is for the heroes.
3 miles northeast of the battlefield, the Huns were slowed by the Seine River, allowing the Romans to gain ground. Both armies knew that a battle was to come, and they prepared for the next day. The Huns setting camp near the river, and the Romans at the modern city of Fontainebleau, about 4 miles west of the fields in the pass through the hills. It was around this time of the Hunnic retreat that legend tells of a beggar that came to Attila and called him the Scourge of God, a title which the leader eagerly accepted. That night, both armies seem to have sent out sizable advance forces, as the Gepids of the Huns and the Franks of the Romans are said to have clashed. That night, the Hunnic sages foretold that Attila would lose the battle, but that an enemy leader would be slain. The next morning, the Huns and their allies filed south into the plains, perhaps hoping to catch the allies in a choke point in the pass. But Aetius and his allies were ready, and it is thought that both sides spent much of the late morning and early afternoon maneuvering. Attila was drawn up front and center of his forces, leading the Hunnic warriors. On his wings were his Germanic allies, with the Gepids and their king Arderic primarily making up his right wing, and the Ostrogoths under Valamir leading the left. The allies likely took more time to prepare, but they had terrain on their side. Theodoric led the Visigoths on the allied right, with the Alans and their king Sangiban in the center. To the left, Aetius, along with Theodoric's son Thorismund, led the Romans up the gentler side of the slope to take the ridge and the high ground. As this was happening, Attila attacked, sending the Gepids and many of his best men up the steep slope to try and take the hill from the Romans. An initial attempt failed, but Attila rallied his men and delivered a harrowing speech. Quote, "Here you stand after conquering mighty nations and subduing the world. I therefore think it foolish for me to goad you with words, as though you were men who had not been proved in action. It is not right for me to say anything common, nor ought you to listen. For what is war but your usual custom? Or what is sweeter for a brave man than to seek revenge with his own hand? It is a right of nature to glut the soul with vengeance. Let us then attack the foe eagerly, for they are ever the bolder who make the attack. See, even before our attack they are smitten with terror. They seek the heights, they seize the hills, and, repenting too late, clamor for protection against battle in the open fields. I am not deceived in the issue. Here is the field so many victories have promised us. I shall hurl the first spear at the foe. If any can stand at rest while Attila fights, he is a dead man." The Huns now energized, the battle entered its bloodiest phase. Huns and Germanics clashed on the slopes, while the Alans checked the Huns and Goths in the plains alongside their Visigothic allies. The historian Jourdan gives the following account of this part of the battle. Quote, "Hand to hand they clashed in battle, and the fight grew fierce, confused, monstrous, unrelenting, a fight whose like no ancient time has ever recorded. There such deeds were done that a brave man who missed this marvelous spectacle could not hope to see anything so wonderful all his life long. For, if we may believe our elders, a brook flowing between low banks through the plain was greatly increased by the blood from the wounds of the slain. It was not flooded by showers, as brooks usually rise, but was swollen by a strange stream that turned into a torrent by the increase of blood. Those whose wounds drove them to slake their parching thirst drank water mingled with gore. In their wretched plight they were forced to drink what they thought were the blood they had poured from their own wounds. At some point in this event, Theodoric fell or was knocked off his horse, and was subsequently trampled to death, probably by his own unwitting men. This did not dissuade the Visigoths, however, partly because they were unaware of what had happened. The formation and its powerful cavalry pushed back the Ostrogoths and defeated them. The Visigoths then wheeled to the left and crashed into the Hunnic flank, decimating their formations and forcing the lightly armored, distance-based warriors to retreat along with whoever survived the onslaughts on the wings. At around the same time, darkness fell and confusion reigned among the allies. Theodoric was still MIA, and leaders were separated from their men. Thorismund accidentally entered the Hunnic camp and was wounded on the head and pulled from his horse. Fortunately, his allies were able to rescue him. Aetius, meanwhile, had gotten separated from his Romans and had to spend the night with Gothic allies. Keep in mind that this was still a tense relationship, and the Goths may have been willing to kill Aetius. The day was so chaotic, neither side even knew who had won. While exact numbers are unknown, and by exact I mean like zero numbers, no one knows, it is thought that each side lost similar but high numbers of men. My personal estimate, given the emphasis put on how bad the battle was, is around 30 to 40,000 dead, with the Huns probably taking slightly more losses, say around 20 to 25,000, and the Allies around 15 to 20,000. But as the sun rose the next day, it was found that bodies riddled the plains. Carnage, unlike any battle in a long time, had fallen upon the usually sleepy countryside. Still, neither side could fully tell who had won, but Attila, despairing in the loss of men that had never yet befallen the Huns, became desperate. Setting himself, his wives, and his most treasured possessions on a funeral pyre, Attila was ready to burn himself alive to prevent the Romans from taking him prisoner. The Huns had no fortifications except wagons, and if the allies chose to attack, there was a good chance they would win. But Aetius chose cunning diplomacy over bloodshed. Besieging the Huns, the allies decided to wait and debate what to do with him. Eventually, Aetius chose peace, although this was not born out of benevolence. If the battle was seen as a great victory, this could raise the morale and patriotism of the Visigoths, who had the lion's share of the forces and who might again rebel against a now very weak Rome. To prevent this, Aetius convinced Thorismund to quickly return home so as to secure his place as his father's successor. Thorismund agreed, and Aetius was able to secure more spoils and accolades for himself. He got the other allies to do the same, and the Huns had tucked their tails between their legs and abandoned their hopes for Gaul. Rome was saved, at least for now, and Aetius secured his position as the most powerful Roman of the era. After Attila's withdrawal, Aetius' strategy to check the barbarians worked, and the Roman realm remained stable. But the Huns were not defeated. The very next year, Attila led the Huns into Roman territory again, this time crossing the Alps and raiding Italy. Through negotiation with the Pope and others, Attila was dissuaded from sacking Rome itself and came to an agreement with the Romans. Attila planned on attacking East Rome the next year after they had stopped paying tribute again, but he died in 453, putting that plan permanently on hold. After Attila's death, the Hunnic realm began to fracture. The next year, in Rome, Emperor Valentinian had grown jealous of Aetius, who commanded loyalty of the military and, if you recall, had supported Valentinian's opponent to the throne decades earlier, actually leading the Huns at that time. The emperor, along with some compatriots, ambushed Aetius at a court session in Ravenna, and after accusing him of all the empire's woes, Valentinian and another drew their swords and struck Aetius in the head, killing him. But the next year, a Roman elite who was jealous he didn't get to inherit Aetius's position enlisted the help of some Huns to kill the emperor. In 455, when Valentinian was going for some archery practice, the assassins struck, stabbing him to death. The guards, having been loyal to Aetius, did nothing to help their emperor. Ironically, Aetius and his Hunnic adversaries had united one last time against the foe that they had first united to defeat decades before. Over the next decades, the same Germanic tribes that had fought with the Huns at the Catalaunian plains now turned against them, turning the Hunnic forces away from Rome and towards the Central European regions. At the same time, other nomadic groups encroached on Eastern Hunnic lands, and the Huns of southeastern Europe began to assimilate with another ethnic group, the Bulgars. By 469, the Huns were effectively gone, but just 7 years later, the barbarians would turn to Rome, now even more weakened than it had been in the previous decades. The Ostrogoths would march into Rome and sack it for the final time in 476, signaling the end of the Roman Empire. Like in the last video, I want to quickly go over some historiography that went into this video. For those who don't know, historiography is essentially meta-history. It's really all about looking at how history has come down to us, including the types of sources, biases in reporting, archaeological evidence, motives, and trying to see how all these things differ or agree so we can try to form an accurate understanding of the past. In the last video, the primary historiographical challenge was trying to figure out where the Battle of Teutoburg actually took place. Secondary, primary, and archaeological sources all seem to have told different or partial stories, and it was an interesting challenge to reconcile these things to try and figure out how the battle progressed. You can watch the last video in the series if you are curious. For this battle, the two main issues for me were A, trying to figure out the specific geography of the battle, and B, trying to determine force and loss numbers. The first of these, of course, is difficult to do if you don't know where the battle took place. There are three main places that the battle is proposed to have happened, and all of them to some degree match the description of the battle. La Chepe, the northernmost battlefield, is essentially in a little valley with a horseshoe-style ridge around it and a stream flowing out to the west. Méry-sur-Seine probably matches less, with the Seine River flowing to its west and a series of ridges to the east. Montgueux, however, matches the best, with a distinct high ground, a stream, and a location along an ancient road. Hence why I am not calling the battle of Chalon, as Creasy calls it, because it likely took place in another location. Plus, the historical source says Catalaunian plains. More modern interpretations of the battle vary slightly on how geography played a role, especially if you look at Wikipedia. The page there explains that most historians think the battle happened along a ridgeline, in part just factoring in military tactics, with each side moving up their respective sides, rather than a hill or just a ridge to one side, which is what the main source for the battle, Jourdan, seems to describe it as. That being said, if we assume that the elusive Catalonian plains are between the Montieu foothills and Troyes, it only seems possible that the hill was off to one side, especially because the one side of the ridge was much steeper, which would have largely nullified cavalry. In short, I think that Wikipedia, which truth be told is one of the few online sources that actually goes into detail about this battle, is mostly incorrect, a belief that I came to with the last video as well. There is even a graphic on the page claiming to show how the battle happened, but this actually contradicts the page's own statements by showing a hill instead of a ridge, and even putting people in the wrong place. For example, Aetius was on the left, but he was also on the high ground, which this map shows the opposite of, so this graphic doesn't really make sense. The other historiographical issue that I had trouble with and still couldn't fully understand was force sizes, especially for the Romans. By the time of the Vandals taking Africa in the 430s, the Roman Empire had effectively collapsed and couldn't levy the taxes to sustain its army as it was before. We also know that the two main sources of Roman forces and fighting styles from this era are either from before the fall of Africa, in which case numbers would have been much higher, or from the post-Roman fall, which also had drastically different composition with a lot more barbarians. As such, it is difficult to figure out exactly how many Romans there were and what proportions were. The battle really took place at the beginning of the Dark Ages, as by this point the Romans had stopped keeping records the same way, and the sharp decrease in written sources starts around this time. As such, it is much more difficult to estimate forces, especially when we remember that most every other battle we've looked at has been waged by a society with lots of written history, namely Greece and Rome. Here we finally don't actually have a good idea of the force sizes, besides the wild exaggerations of historical sources from decades later. So, how important was this battle to world history? Unlike the other battles we've covered so far, I really don't think this was impactful. Creasy's idea, which I read at the beginning of the video, essentially claims that had Attila been successful, he would have taken over the Roman Empire and squashed the Germanics that would be the ones to continue European history forward, changing the character of post-Roman Europe. However, even with what we've seen so far, that probably isn't the case. Let's start with the battle itself. The battle took place where the Huns were already retreating. The real defeat had already been at the Siege of Orleans, and the Roman coalition showed up to check them. They had already been stopped and checked. That's not to say that nothing could have come from the battle, however. With the Hunnic defeat, it showed that the Huns were not invincible. Similar to how Marathon shattered the concept of Persian invincibility, the Romans and Germanics had done the same to Attila. This was not only psychologically important, but also weakened the Hunnic forces. Further, if the Roman or Visigothic armies had been completely decimated, it would have made it harder for them to repel other enemies, or may have incentivized the Huns to counterattack. Even though both sides likely had similar losses, it was a bigger shock to the Huns since they weren't used to such high casualties and high attrition rates, while the Europeans, while still not liking it, were more used to it. Next, let's consider the wider dynamics of the Huns and Romans. The Huns were not really an existential threat. Aetius, after all, had lived among them for decades, and these civilizations were certainly capable of coexistence. Even when Attila invaded the next year, they came to an agreement and weren't in danger of being totally overrun or destroyed. The fact that an invasion of Italy happened the very next year also shows that the battle didn't weaken the Huns enough to actually be influential. We could say though, to be fair, the fact that the battle was so bad may have incentivized Attila to negotiate with Rome instead of risking another costly battle. Then we can look at what happened to areas controlled by the Huns, and of course the imminent demise of both. Many areas that were subjugated by the Huns were largely depopulated, and we saw mass migrations, although the Huns rarely imposed their own culture, and in that sense they had a light footprint. Still, the Goths and Vandals moved to Central Europe and Africa, the Franks moved to Gaul, and the Visigoths moved to Spain. If we make the jumps that the battle going the other way would have led to the Huns taking much of Western Europe, we could assume that Italians and Romans would also migrate to some degree, although certainly to a lesser degree than the Germanics, as they had fortified cities and more powerful diplomatic powers. They still had stuff that the Huns wanted. We can also take into account geography. It's hard to have nomadic horsemen living in the Alps, for example. Still, migrations from Italy and Gaul to other places, likely Iberia and the East Empire, would probably have happened. But these migrations would have been cut short anyway, as just a couple years later Attila ends up dying, and the Huns lose most of their power. Not long after, Rome would still fall anyway. In short, I think we can say that had the battle gone the other way, Rome may have fallen slightly earlier, perhaps as early as 451 instead of 476. There would also be migration to the far west, Africa, and the East Empire, although this would be short-lived as the Huns would collapse not long after these conquests. European history would largely be the same, and the Huns' transient nature would have little effect past speeding along the inevitable collapse of Rome. Hundreds of years after the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, the Germanic tribes would take over Europe, with the most formidable of them, the Franks, controlling most of the central and western parts of the continent. However, a new threat to Europe came, this time, ironically, from the west. Sort of. Muhammad and his ancestors had led military campaigns across Asia and Africa, conquering the Arabian Peninsula, Mesopotamia, Persia, Egypt, and North Africa in record time. Moving north, the Umayyad Caliphate moved into Spain, conquering the peninsula, and pushed into Gaul. It was here at the Battle of Tours that the Franks under Charles Martel would clash with the Umayyads for the fate of medieval Europe. So that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.